I want to welcome our guest today. He is the fantasy editor for the NFL. This is Marcus Grant. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, I appreciate the invitation.
So I want to start with just a big question. Can you share your journey to the NFL?
Yeah, well, first off, I never imagined doing fantasy football as a career. I honestly, I had played sort of socially. I was even like a big time competitive player. I would just play kind of as a social thing, just to kind of keep up with friends, sort of thing. Um, I started kind of my journey through radio. I worked as a play-by-play announcer for a couple of minor league teams. I did 2 seasons of that up and down the Central Valley of California. I was lucky enough after that to kind of land in radio, working for a series of like low power AM sports talk radio stations. Lived in Fresno for about 5.5 years doing that, and at some point got an offer to move. I went to school in Los Angeles, went to USC, and then I got an offer to move back to LA to work for what was then Sporting News Radio, as just kind of a jack of all trades. I was an update anchor, I was a producer, I filled in as a host, for a while doing stuff, and so I did that for about a year and a half, maybe 2 years. At some point, the company was sold to a guy who wanted to move operations. He was from Houston. He wanted to move the operations close to where he lived in Houston. I was not interested so much in moving to Houston. I like Los Angeles, and
Yeah.
I took it. I went and I looked around. I have family that lives in Houston. I went and looked at it, and I just said, I would prefer to stay in LA. I'll figure something out. So for close to a year, I was just kind of free doing some writing, hanging out, just trying to make ends meet. However, after a while, one of my former coworkers at the NFL or at Sporting News Radio, I should say, had been working at the NFL part time, kind of seasonally, and he suggested to me, "Hey, look, they're always looking for people, especially once the football season comes around. You should apply." So I went on the website, applied for about 4 or 5 jobs. Most of which I don't think I was qualified for, but I was like, whatever, I'll give it a shot. And this was in 2011. So, the big fear at the time was that there was going to be a lockout, or there was actually
Oh, that's right. Yeah,
lockout.
that's right.
The fear is that it was going to impact the season. They weren't sure if there's going to be actual games. So I applied for these jobs, knowing that there was a lockout, not sure what the future was going to be. Didn't hear anything for a few months. And then I got a phone call from Michael Fabiano, who was the lead fantasy guy at the NFL at the time. And, he called me up. He said, would you like to interview for a job writing about fantasy football? And I said, does it pay? And he said, yeah. And I'm like, sure, let's do it. Look, man, I beat what I was doing. I was, freelance writing for pennies and sitting on the couch watching reruns of Law and Order SVU. So I'm like, this was something decent. So I went in, I interviewed, and I was literally the day the lockout ended. I remember waking up in the morning, turning on the TV, seeing on ESPN that the owners and the players had come to an agreement. The lockout was over. There was going to be a football season. And I think within an hour or two of me seeing that report, I get a call from the NFL offering me the job. So that was August of 2011. In fact, I think I just recently passed 9 years officially at the NFL. Yeah. So if there is a season, fingers crossed this year, this will be season number 10, year number 9, season number 10 for me. And so, like I said, I never anticipated it. Never thought of fantasy football analysis as a career, but it's been a fun ride so far.
So I had a question. So I know when I reached out, I mentioned the reality of the sports industry and that it's difficult for Black and brown men and women to find opportunities, especially if they aren't former athletes. Just from my own experience researching the fantasy industry, it seems even more relevant. Like if you look at some of the top podcasts, some of the major shows on networks, unless it's someone like Maurice Jones-Drew, it's difficult to see someone who's not a former player, get opportunities. So did that aspect of the sports and fantasy sports industry have any role in your journey to the NFL?
I think it's helped, I would say, especially recently. Look, we are in a moment, let's just be honest, we are in a moment where there, I think, has been sort of a reckoning about the lack of black and brown faces, especially in media in general, certainly in sports media. you're right. When you look across the landscape of fantasy sports, it is generally, white guys age 18 to 49, right? That's the majority of who is doing the analysis. And so I think that's starting to change because, look, everybody plays fantasy football. It is a wide spectrum of people who play it. And at some point, I feel like, the people who analyze it, who talk about it, who write about it, should start to look like the people who play. And so, like I said, I've been fortunate to sort of land here. When I started in 2011, fantasy football analysis as an industry was barely a thing, right? It was just a burgeoning thing. So the idea even of just, striving for diversity, it wasn't talked about because you were just happy to have somebody who could talk about it competently at all, no matter what they look like. But it has started to become a bigger thing, and I know that I really, I think in the last year or two especially, have been trying to help as much as I can. I've been lucky in the last couple of years to sort of take over hosting the NFL's fantasy podcast, and this past year, in fact, the last month or so, I was kind of doing a little what I called fantasy camp, where I would talk about each division, break it down. And so I would have guests come on, and I really made it a point to try and have a wide diversity of guests, right? So I had, just reaching out to the Black analysts and podcasters that I knew and getting them on, getting, women on, as much as possible to kind of give them a voice.
The Ball Blast girls on.
The Majuks on. Yeah, I had them on. Cynthia Freeland, who works with us, who is incredibly smart. I've had her on a few times. Liz Loza over at Yahoo. But I had Chris Allen and Eric Moody, who are a couple of Black analysts who are doing stuff, and I wanted to get them on the show. And so, I would like to continue doing that even into the regular season, just trying to get those diversity of voices out there. One, because I feel like even for my listeners, it's nice to hear somebody other than just my voice all the time, but also to sort of try to elevate those other voices as much as possible. So, it has been kind of a slow turn, I think, in a lot of ways, but I do think that the moment that we are living in has sort of accelerated it in the last, like I said, several weeks.
You touched on it a little bit, in terms of like what you're doing, but do you see other possible solutions for this dearth of like Black and brown talent, and even like you said, like women in the industry?
Yeah, I mean, I do think it is sort of incumbent on the gatekeepers to kind of change that a little bit. I will say that when it comes to fantasy sports, and I would just say in sports media in general, but especially fantasy sports, there are so many people who are doing it, and there's so many people doing really creative things, that there are people who are sort of trying to make their own way, which is really encouraging. I think that's really refreshing. But I think to have those voices at a higher level in a more visible spot, it is still sort of incumbent on the gatekeepers to try to knock down those doors a little bit. I know I had a conversation right at the kind of the peak of the protests right after George Floyd's death. I know that I had a lot of white friends sort of reach out to me and ask, what can I do? How can I help? Tell me about what's going on, how you're feeling. And I had a conversation with another in the industry, pretty well-known guy, great guy that I've had a long, very good relationship with. And he was asking me like, hey, what can I do as kind of an older white guy to sort of help here? And I said, look, you first of all have always been very good to me. From when I was first starting, you were very encouraging at the very beginning of my career. We built a great relationship. And I said, part of it is that you have been very sincere in your not just your praise, your constructive criticism, all of that. And what I know of you is you are like that with everybody. And I said, keep doing that. First of all, keep taking these voices that generally aren't getting heard, continue to encourage them, continue to praise them, continue to kind of give them an opportunity. I mean, you've got a serious radio show. You write for different online publications. You can really help because you're a respected voice to kind of get these names and these faces out here. And I think that's the thing that sort of has to happen. And I think, like I said, I think we are starting to get to that point. And I'm going to keep doing whatever I can to sort of help that in as many ways as possible. But I do think that the more we can start to kind of inform and educate people, not so much that that these other voices can do it, these other people can do it, but just that they're there. I think that's sort of the biggest thing, is just letting people know that these people are there, and that they are it's just about putting people top of mind. And once you see that and you see the quality of work they're doing, I think you're going to see more of those doors open up.
Yeah. I wrote my dissertation on fantasy football, and I was specifically looking at the words and phrases that are frequently used by the fantasy football community, kind of see what ties everybody together. And one thing that emerged that I haven't really been able to shake since I wrote it is the way that many people talk about players themselves. And I understand, I'm a player. I've been an avid player since 2010. Love fantasy football. And it's all about having fun, but it also clearly separates the production from the human being who is creating that production. And it's hard to divorce that from the dark side of fantasy football, where players use Twitter or Instagram to berate players for their performance. So what are your thoughts on the language used in fantasy and that link between fantasy players and NFL players?
Yeah, it's a thing that I have been increasingly uncomfortable with. You talk about for a long time, people talked about owners and owning players, and you're right. The way that the language sort of treats players as commodities and not humans. It's something that I think I've been uncomfortable with for a while. But I will say this. Especially, again, we talk about kind of being in this moment that we're in. It is something that I think is changing. I know that I can speak for, the NFL, Yahoo, ESPN, I believe Roto World is the other one. We have all recently announced a major change in how we are going to talk about fantasy and the words we're going to use. So, for a couple of years now, I have ditched the term fantasy football owner, and we have gone to fantasy football manager, so that you are managing a roster. But recently some of the big changes have included, instead of talking about auction drafts, calling them salary cap drafts. Instead of saying, you're handcuffing players together, right? If you draft a star running back, and you should also draft his backup. For a long time, we talked about that as handcuffing. Instead of using that, now we're starting to say, drafting a backup or an understudy, or getting insurance, for the player, that sort of thing. Instead of saying that you own a player, you have a player rostered or what have you. Right. So the language around that really is starting to change, because I think that the people were starting to get increasingly uncomfortable. I think again, this is another thing that has to start at the top. That's why I think it's good that it's the NFL, it's ESPN, it's Yahoo, it's Roto World. You're talking about kind of the big four when it comes to fantasy content out there making this change. Yeah, it's going to take time. It's going to have to trickle down. I have always advocated for, look, don't bother the players, man. Don't tweet it, guys. It's especially after they have bad games, right? They know they had a bad day. Yeah. When we have a bad day at work, the last thing you want is somebody coming in and harassing you about it. You just don't want to do that. So I think that's been a big push for a long time. But I do think there are still things that make me uncomfortable. For instance, recently, obviously, Darius Geis was a big story here. This is a guy who, was a high draft pick, that they had a big expectations for him in Washington. And now he's not on a roster because he was charged with several counts of domestic violence. He turned himself into the police. He was immediately released by the club. We get those situations. And one thing that I've always felt really uncomfortable with is, immediately the story breaks, and in fantasy football, on fantasy Twitter, the conversation right away turns to, okay, well, who's the next man up? Who's the guy that we should go pick up? Who's the guy that we should draft? Who should you be trading for? And I always feel awkward about it. And whenever we've talked about it on the podcast, I always feel the need to sort of make a big disclaimer about, hey, look, what is happening here, what this story really is something really sinister and ugly and terrible, and we should take a moment to acknowledge that. But I always throw in the fact that, hey, look, I understand we are a fantasy football podcast, and so because of that, let's talk about what the implications are for fantasy football. And it's always sort of a weird juxtaposition, right? Just went through it with Geis. I remember going through it with Adrian Peterson, after the allegations of child abuse. And it's just, I don't know how to do it, in a good way. But But I do just wish sometimes that a lot of the fantasy analysts and writers would at least take a moment to sort of pause and acknowledge what this awful thing is that's happened before we immediately dive into, all right, well, who's the next guy on the roster that's going to get touches? And
Right.
I don't have a good answer for that, but I do think that's something that that's one that I think we're still as an industry kind of struggling with how to tackle.
Yeah, and I think you brought up a good point about earlier when you talked about kind of things starting at the top. There's a couple things that in terms of the fantasy industry I'll never forget. I think it was one of those weekends where ESPN was doing like those 24 hours straight of fantasy, and there was like an actual auction going on.
Yeah, that went badly.
At some point, I'm like, there has to be someone in the room that knows that this is not okay. And more recently, I think there was an incident with the Fantasy Pros, and very quickly that situation getting addressed in terms of one of their people harassing someone a female in the industry.
Yeah.
But I think that goes to show that there is at least some progress in terms of addressing something that's important, and it's something that needs to be addressed quickly.
Yeah, no, I would agree, and yeah, you're right. The Fantasy Pros thing, you had one of their analysts who was sending kind of threatening and just ugly messages to a woman that he only knew through Twitter. Like he had just met her on Twitter, and was sending her just really really vile messages. And yeah, they moved very quickly to kind of take care of that. And so I do think it's weird in the sense that fantasy football I've always, there's that old quote from years ago that sports is the toy department of life. And I've always said that fantasy sports is sort of the experimental wing of the toy department because of that. But I think there has become more of an awareness that, look, we still operate within the confines of a society, right? And so while we may sort of live in our own little, no pun intended, fantasy world, right? We talk about a game, that there are still real world issues, that we're all still real people, right? We all still have real lives, and we all still have to sort of live within the context of a society. And so I think that has become a bigger thing. And I think that's also, I also think though that it is a benefit of the increasing diversity within the industry. As you have more people of color getting in, as you have more women, like these are the things that get talked about, right? Like if this were an industry that was strictly male, I don't know that you have the loud major outcry that you did over what happened with Fantasy Pros. I mean, maybe you do have a few voices that say, hey, look, that's not cool, you got to do something about it. But I don't think that if it was, just 100% a male industry, I don't know that Fantasy Pros moves as quickly as they do to kind of make changes there. And so I think that is a positive of having just a larger diversity of voices involved in this.
Yeah. I interviewed Patrick Claybon a couple days ago, and I forgot to ask him this just because for both of you all, I arranged these interviews via just getting into your DMs on Twitter. So I have to ask, being such a fixture in the fantasy industry, what is your Twitter experience like, specifically your mentions and your DMs? You know what?
Mine are pretty good. I will say that. I have been very fortunate in that respect. I know Patrick's report are sort of different. Patrick is definitely very outspoken when it comes to a lot of things, especially when it comes to social and political issues. I will kind of dip in the water. I'm certainly not quite as forward as he is. And so, look, I feel like when I do that, I do get pushback, and you do get people who are maybe kind of vile and nasty. Maybe because I don't do it as much, I don't get quite as many of them. I know Patrick's are probably worse. That's not to say I don't. I've been called the N-word on Twitter a couple of times in my mentions. One randomly, it's sort of a funny story, I guess, if these things can be funny. I was tweeting back and forth with a friend of mine about. There's a reality show called Vanderpump Rules.
Oh, I'm a big fan of Vanderpump Rules.
Okay, so a friend of mine was tweeting about it, and I responded to her that I had been to SUR before. I had been to SUR for a friend's birthday party, and that Jax made me an old fashioned, and I commented that it just wasn't a very good drink. It just wasn't a well-made drink, and that was kind of my lasting impression. And some random third person that neither of us knew jumped in my mentions to apparently take offense over me saying Jack's made a bad cocktail, and called me the N-word over it. It was like, what is happening? It was kind of amazing, so I just immediately blocked him and kind of went on with my day. But I will say that on the whole, my mentions, my DMs are generally pretty good. They're all mostly fantasy related. Every once in a while I get somebody who steps out of line, and I generally don't make a big fuss out of it. I just block them, and I just keep it pushing.
I have a question in terms of like leadership, because in terms of I'm teaching a sports leadership class, and given your experience with previous editors and supervisors and your current role as fantasy editor, and more importantly, because I know there's been a lot of departures from the NFL fantasy team over the last couple of years. So what qualities of a leader do you think are important to succeed in the sports industry?
I think I'll say this: the best boss I've ever had came at the NFL, and it was a black woman. She is to this day, and those of us, look, even the people who've left, there are a lot of us who still keep in contact and talk pretty regularly, and we still talk about the fact that this was the best boss that a lot of us have ever had. And one of the things I think that made her that was a strength was, one, she sort of gave us latitude to go out and try things and do things. But the thing that stuck with me about working with her and working for her is that she never made you feel like any idea was a bad idea, right? You could come to her with an idea, and she may say, hey, look, maybe we can tweak this. Maybe we can, find ways to sort of adjust this a little bit. But you never were left with the feeling that your idea was a bad idea. Even if maybe it didn't work. Maybe you tried it and it failed spectacularly. Like, who knows? But she always at least gave you the feeling that, you know what? Hey, look, maybe there's something here. Let's look at it. Let's see how we can dig into it a little bit and make this into something good. And that alone just sort of gives you the confidence to go out and try things, right? Knowing that, that you're not going to immediately get shot down over it. Like I said, hey, maybe you try it, and after a few weeks or months or a year, you look at it and you're like, yeah, this just didn't work out. Like this just didn't turn out the way we wanted it to. Let's scrap it. Let's try something else. And that's fine. But, I've worked for other people, both in this company and outside of this company, where you have an idea, you come to them with something, and the immediate response is, yeah, that seems cool, but ... After you hear that enough times, you just sort of stop coming up with ideas, because you just know that that's going to be the answer. And so I think that's sort of the biggest thing is, look, just give people the leeway, especially I think in this industry, in sports media and in fantasy sports especially, give people the leeway to try to be creative, to try to do something good. And I think more often than not, you're going to get more hits than misses, because I just think that you give people that space, they're going to be confident, and more than anything, I think confidence sells more than even maybe the basis of the idea.
Yeah. More specifically, what advice would you give to someone who, I know given the pandemic, I think there's a lot of folks that are trying to find ways of exploring like podcasting and things like that. What advice would you give to anyone considering a career in fantasy sports?
I would just say just get out there and do it, because there are so many more avenues to doing it. And I get asked this question a lot. One of the consistent things in my DMs, usually it's like high school or college students who are interested in sort of getting into this and asking me that. And I tell them, like, first off, there are so many more avenues now to sort of get into this versus certainly when I was in college and high school, but even when I first started this, right? Twitter was kind of established, but it was certainly not the juggernaut, the behemoth it was now in terms of that it is now in terms of content. So between TikTok, whatever, I'm waiting for the first person to sort of conquer TikTok on a fantasy basis. I've seen people sort of dabble in it. But I think somebody out there is going to really sort of grab it by the throat and really kind of take control of it and do something great. And I think whoever does that first is going to have a huge following there. That's, I guess, governmental issues with TikTok aside, but whoever takes control of that is going to have a huge following. So get out there and do that. And I think the best part about that is doing it, on those social media platforms, doing it when you have a relatively, small following at the beginning. It allows you to get reps and sort of make those mistakes, right? Like it's a lot harder to get out there and make mistakes, doing what I do, because, you're on a national network and you have a larger platform. And if you do something like really, whatever, you make a small little mistake, you brush that off. But if you do something kind of like really weird or whack or terrible, like you've got, thousands of people who are watching, millions of people who are watching it in some instances, and they're all telling you about it. Like doing it kind of gives you the chance to be experimental even more so.
Right.
And I think that's kind of the big thing. And on top of that, the other thing I would say is just sort of introduce yourself to the fantasy community. It is a large, vibrant community on Twitter. And you know what? In my experience, the overwhelming majority of those folks are very welcoming. They're very friendly. They're always willing to kind of bring new people in. And so, if you just start doing that work and you start kind of interacting with those fantasy folks on Twitter, you are likely to find a footing. I've seen people that have followed me for years that started out literally as just fantasy players, just fans who were just engaging in content. Now they are creating their own content, whether they're writing for somebody or they're doing a podcast. And it's been really kind of fun to see that grow. I mentioned Chris Allen, who I had on my podcast a few weeks ago. Chris was a guy that, when I first started on Twitter and started doing this, like he would hit me up for advice or whatever. Now Chris is like writing for a couple of different sites. He's hosting a podcast, and so I've been really excited to kind of see that growth. So I think that's just sort of the big thing, man. Just get out there and try it, because you can do it for cheap or even free, depending on what platforms you're using, and just find a way to just sort of. One last thing. I know I'm sort of rambling, but
no, you're good.
My other thing is, when you do connect with people in the fantasy industry, do it genuinely. Like do it, create conversation. Start with don't just, rush up to somebody or jump in somebody's mentions and immediately just bombard them with links to articles or podcasts or what have you. Most of us are definitely willing to read your stuff or listen to your podcast or whatever, but it is sort of nice. I'm much more willing to do it with people who are willing to engage with me sort of on a human level, as opposed to being some sort of fantasy advice ATM. So I guess that's sort of the other way to approach it.
Got it. So I would be remiss if I had you on and did not ask at least one fantasy football related question. So a couple late round players you're targeting and a couple early round players you're fading.
Early round guys I'm fading. I'll start with that one. Amari Cooper is one. I just don't want to ride the roller coaster. It's nice when he gives you those 200-yard games with a couple of touchdowns. That's really great. But then when he follows it up with one catch for 14 yards, then you're feeling pretty miserable. So that's one I'm definitely avoiding. I had sort of been off the Nick Chubb train for a while. Just I was worried about what Kareem Hunt was going to do. But I feel like his ADP has come down enough that maybe I can sort of get back on there again. Late round guys that I am into, I think most of them are probably tight ends, just because I feel like the tight end position is – I won't say it's bottom heavy, but there are a lot of high upside guys that you can take dart throws at a little bit later. I like Hayden Hurst in Atlanta. Now that he's sort of the guy. He's kind of a 10th, 11th round guy. Blake Jarwin in Dallas. Jason Witten was the tight end 11 last year, and basically all he did was catch the ball and fall down. So I feel like Blake Jarwin, being younger and more athletic, could really be in a good spot there. And Mike Gesicki, who was every fantasy analyst's favorite sleeper tight end, is another guy. But I feel like his ADP has gone up a little more than I would like it to, so I sort of have gotten out on that train.
And I just wanted to commend you, because I think what you've been doing the last few weeks, I've been tuning into the podcast, and all the different guests and the variety of guests that you've been bringing on has been fantastic. I also, back when you all had the stronghold, I know you had the reunion episode a little while ago. I think that was easily one of the most diverse group of folks doing a podcast in the fantasy industry, and I think that was a big reason why it was so popular and resonated with so many people.
You know what? I am really pleased by the response. We had I mentioned at the end of the podcast, we had sort of kicked around the idea of us getting back together and doing a reunion show, and the timing just could never quite work out. So finally, we were able to get it done. We've been encouraged by the fact that people still hit us up and just saying, "Hey, man, I miss when you guys were all together. It was a lot of fun." I will say that selfishly, I sort of put it together for my own personal benefit because I just thought it would be fun to get back and do a show with those guys again. But we have all just been floored and completely humbled by the response to it, by the way people responded to that show. So, it was fun. It was great. I still love those guys. We still talk, almost daily. All of us. So it was good. So, because of that response, maybe we'll think about doing another one. Maybe we'll try to figure out if we can do it like once a year or something like that.
That'd be great.
Because we enjoy it, and I'm glad that people out there really enjoyed it.
Absolutely. So, you all should be listening to the NFL Fantasy Podcast with Marcas. On Twitter, he is at Marcus G, and that's Marcus MarCasG, or you can go to marcusgrant.com. Marcus, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate you taking out the time and hanging out with us for a little bit.
I appreciate it, Art. I enjoyed the conversation.
All right, have a good one.
You too.